Thank you for listening to Vision Resources Audio Services. Coming up next is another InSight interview featuring Father Michael Scalzi. Today, Father Michael interviews local author, pastor, and John Harris reenactor David Biser as they discuss David's book about Harrisburg founder John Harris Jr.
Hi, everybody. This is Father Michael, one of the volunteers here at Vision Resources of Central Pennsylvania's Audio Services. And we have another wonderful interview for you today, and I'm so honored and pleased that Pastor Dave Biser is with us. Pastor Biser is a pastor at Cross Point Church in Harrisburg, Methodist Church. And Dave, it's great to have you.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're so welcome. The reason that he's here is not to talk about being a pastor, but Dave is an author. And he's an author of a very wonderful book, which was so interesting to read. It's called Visionary Road to the Capitol, The Little-Known Story of John Harris Jr. And we're going to get into all that over the next 30 minutes. So before we begin, Dave, may I tell you a story?
Yes, you can. Go for it.
So I was in the broadcasting business for many, many years before I became a pastor, and I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and I was very close to the mayor of New Haven, Mayor Biagio, a really wonderful Italian guy. And so when I left New Haven and came to this area, I thought, well, I want to become friends with the mayor here. So I sent a letter to Stephen Reed at the time. Did you know Mayor Reed?
Yes.
Okay. All right. A real character.
Yes, indeed.
A wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man.
Right.
So I sent him a letter, and I said, I'm new to town. I'm running a radio station here in Harrisburg, and I had a great relationship with the mayor in New Haven, and I would like to foster that same relationship with you. And in those days, of course, it was just snail mail. So I sent the letter, and it must have gotten there the next day because that afternoon I got a call from Mayor Reed's secretary asking me if I would be able to meet with the mayor the following afternoon at 2 o'clock. And of course I said yes. So I went in and sat with Mayor Reed for well over 2 hours. We drank tons of coffee, and he was a man who was very proud of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I left his office with armloads filled with material about Harrisburg. And I went home and devoured it because I wanted to know everything about the city that I was now living in. However, I must tell you that there was very little material about John Harris Jr. There was a lot of brochures about all the different attractions, and he gave me fiscal statements and all sorts of things about Harrisburg. But there wasn't a lot about the history of Harrisburg, and I love history. So along comes Dave Biser, and he writes a book all about John Harris Jr. And I took this book and I read it cover to cover and enjoyed it so much. It's not a hard read at all. It's a wonderful book, and we're going to talk more about that as we go through these next few minutes. So Dave, tell me what brought you to writing this book.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for thank you for that setup. Mayor Reed was in so many ways a phenomenal character for the city of Harrisburg to promote the city. But you're right, he was limited in his ability to share information about the history of the city because it had not been compiled yet. And so I had an opportunity some years back, almost 20 years ago, to portray John Harris as a first-person character. As a part of a reenacting group, our group was contacted by the Dauphin County Historical Society, and they asked if there was somebody who'd be willing to do a first-person portrayal at one of their fundraisers. And so I said, sure, I would go down and do that. At the end of the night, they asked if I would come back and do it again, and I said no. If you want somebody to just walk around and pretend to be somebody, you can find somebody at Theater Harrisburg to do that, I'm sure. And that would be fine. I'm not interested. But I said, if you're interested in somebody really diving into the person and actually portraying the person, I would be interested in that kind of conversation to happen and see if we could develop that. About 3 weeks later, I was sitting at the table at the Dauphin County Historical Society with all of John Harris's material in front of me and a pair of white gloves. And they said, have at it. If you're interested in a first-person portrayal, we would love to see that happen. So I dove in at that point with no real foreknowledge of this individual because it didn't exist. There was no singular volume that had been written about John Harris. It had been hoped for back in the centennial of the nation, back in the 100th anniversary of the nation. Mm-hmm. There was a comment that there should be a book written about John Harris as the founder of the capital city, but it had never taken place. And so as I was researching information on how to portray this guy effectively, not only was I doing a lot of training in first-person interpretation, but I was also memorizing this guy's life. And I discovered that I had to go to a lot of different resources to find information about him. And as I did, I compiled a ring binder full of material. And then COVID hit. Go figure, right? I had some time on my hands all of a sudden. And I had been asked several times, is there a book on this guy? And so I thought, well, maybe now's the time for me to compile that book. So I started writing during COVID in 2020 and outlined the book and then started writing chapters. And by the time I got to about 2022, I had pretty much most of the book written. 2023, we went to the publisher, and by the end of 23, we went to print. I hope that answered your question.
No, it did. It answered it wonderfully. And, of course, as you're talking, I'm thinking of other questions that I had not considered asking you. This might be a silly question, and if it is, you can tell me. But in your travels, in your research, and the people that you meet, do people even know that there was a John Harris, or do they think Harrisburg was named after whatever?
Well, that's a great question. No. It makes sense almost immediately when people discover that, there's a guy named Harris. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, right.
But most people don't know that there was a fellow by the name of John Harris. If they know anything, it's because they took a walk down on Front Street or the park down along Front Street and came across John Harris Sr.'s cemetery that's there. His gravesite is there still to this day, and so. Oftentimes I get the question, is that a relation? Well, of course it is. It's his father.
Yeah.
So, so they might know just a little bit for that reason.
And some people might know John Harris High School, of course, so they would make that connection,
Yeah,
too.
very much so.
So before we go to the next question, just in case you've just joined us, we're honored today to have with us Pastor David Biser, who has written a wonderful story of John Harris Jr. It's called Visionary Road to the Capitol. And Dave, tell me about the life of John Harris.
Yeah, this guy is a fascinating individual. I had no connection to him personally. There's nothing genealogically that connected me to him whatsoever. So my entire research was done just from a historical standpoint until I discovered that probably my own ancestors came across the ferry that he started here on the Susquehanna River. Actually, his father began that ferry. His father was given a grant by William Penn himself of 300 acres to set up a town, a trading post, start something there on the Susquehanna River. So John Harris Jr. is born right there on the Susquehanna River, right at Front Street, just across of Front Street from where his current house is at today, which is still standing from the 1760s. So Harris Jr. is born here along with his siblings. He's raised here on the frontier, but he's educated in Philadelphia. His mother makes sure of that, and he's baptized in Christ Church in Philadelphia at the age of 11 months. Mm-hmm. So that's how we establish his birth date and his age is off of his baptismal record, actually.
Okay.
That's in existence. So that as a side note, needless to say, baptismal records are important.
Yes, they are.
So there
They're
you go.
kept in fireproof file cabinets.
Yes, and that helped me establish his birth date. So that says a lot. So yeah, he's raised here as his father establishes a trading post. He establishes a tavern, and he establishes the Harris Ferry that takes people across the mile-wide Susquehanna River. His father establishes a relationship with a native population and has a license to trade with them. He also trades with the frontiersmen who are going out into the wilderness, which is anything on the western shore of the Susquehanna in that time period. He's instrumental in several Indian treaties, which are all land treaties and establishing where people can be and where natives need to be and where those lines exist. He is friends with a lot of the native chiefs and makes himself well known among them and establishes himself as the premier person that the natives want to trade with here on the frontier. So he also serves in government in Pennsylvania. So he's a part of the Pennsylvania Assembly, and so he's making regular trips down to Philadelphia. He's doing business in Reading and Lancaster, and so he's quite an interesting fellow. As I started digging into his life, he becomes an officer in what is considered the provincial American militia that the British have stationed all up and down the eastern coast. And so he's a captain in the militia, and he becomes a storehouse for goods here on the frontier. So he's storing gunpowder, muskets, flints, all kinds of supplies for soldiers out here on the frontier during the French and Indian War. And that establishes himself not only as a tradesman, not only as a frontiersman and a pioneer, but also as a military individual, and a business person and a political individual. So he's got his feet in all kinds of different places, and that makes him a pretty popular guy back in that day.
So we're looking at the 1750s?
Yes.
That okay?
Right.
I think the timeline here is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
it is. He's born in 1727.
Okay.
So, for intents and purposes, the beginning of the 18th century. And he's going to live all the way to almost the end of the 18th century to 1791.
Wow.
So he's going to span most of the 1700s.
Yeah. So well-known, well-liked?
Yes. Yeah, his obituary says that he is well-loved and well admired by any individual who's ever met him in their lifetime. And so it's kind of a remarkable statement. I wish they'd say that about me when I'm passing, because to have it said that everybody loved him. Everybody, this guy was just loved and admired by everyone. That's quite a, we always flourish and heighten people's existence when they pass and say nice things about people, but this was a genuinely wonderful thing to say about someone.
We didn't say well-respected.
Yeah,
he was well-respected,
Yes.
and that, I think, is
Right.
being well-liked is sometimes, that's not too hard, but being well-respected is so much more important, I think.
Yeah, he was trusted. He was trustworthy. And in that time period, natives were suspicious. There had been enough treaties broken that they needed to have somebody in their life that they could work with, that they could trust. And they found that in John Harris.
Mm-hmm. Again, if you're just joining us, we're with Pastor Dave Biser, who has written a book about the life of John Harris Jr., Visionary Road to the Capitol. You have visionary in your title, so I want to ask you about John Harris's vision.
Yeah, that's a great question, too. So the vision stemmed first from William Penn, who wanted to create the second most beautiful city in all of the colony of Pennsylvania, the first being Philadelphia. And he wanted to establish the second most beautiful city on the shore of the Susquehanna. And so John Harris Sr. takes up that cause and is sent to the Susquehanna with a charter. And John Harris Jr. takes over that challenge and begins to build what is going to become, in his visionary thought process, the city of Harrisburg. He has that vision. He has that dream of establishing the second most beautiful city in the state of Pennsylvania. And as he does that, he's recruiting people to come in who are businessmen, who are tradesmen, who are pastors. He donates land for a church and the capital. He wants to see this become something really unique. And his ultimate vision that he shares with his son-in-law, William McClay, is that he wants to see government move from Philadelphia out to Harrisburg. At some point, he dreams that it would happen because that's where people are moving. And he saw Harrisburg as the hub of the state of Pennsylvania, that everything came into Harrisburg and then went out from Harrisburg into the rest of the state of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And so why not bring government from Philadelphia out to Harrisburg? They had done so in New York. They had moved out to Albany. They had done so in Virginia. They had moved from Williamsburg out to Richmond. And so he saw that as the next step here in the state of Pennsylvania, was that government would move west with the people. And he saw Harrisburg as the place to do that. And so his vision really was to see this grand capital city develop.
This is Vision Resource. Speaking of vision, This is Vision Resources of Central Pennsylvania. InSight interviews. I'm Father Michael, one of the volunteers here at Vision Resources, with our guest Dave Biser, the author of Visionary Road to the Capitol. As you're talking, Dave, I can't help but think of comparing him to Milton Hershey when you were talking about his vision for Harrisburg and all that. Milton Hershey had something similar when he built the town. The town was called Derry back then, but he also gave money to every single religious denomination to build a church in the town. He didn't show favoritism toward anyone. So some parallels there. Like I said, just couldn't help but think about that.
No, I would agree completely, Father Michael, that I think some of the great individuals that we've seen do things in America are first visionaries. They had to see it possible before creating it. So I would agree with you completely.
So what would you say were some of the top challenges that he encountered through his life?
Well, so the French and Indian War was not easy for him. He was ambushed. He, as a military captain, he was out on patrol with 40 of his men and ambushed and considered lost and dead for a season of a week until he could make his way back home. Some of the treaties that had happened and had been broken by the colonists caused him some great consternation. He had a constant stream of natives coming through his house who would complain about the colonials encroaching in on land that they weren't supposed to, and so he was constantly in conversation with the Pennsylvania government about those kinds of issues. I think one of the most devastating things for him, though, that I would highlight was life on the frontier was not easy. To his first wife, her name was Elizabeth, he would have 5 children. One would die in infancy, and the other would die later on. In the same year that he lost his first wife to illness, he would lose his 4th child in illness in that same year. So he loses a wife and a child in that same year. And that child's about 6 years old when she dies. So right, yeah, infancy is one thing, and then when you 6 years old, and then he remarries, and he's going to go on to have 11 more children. Only 5 of those 11 are going to live into adulthood. The rest are either going to pass in infancy or in childhood diseases. Disease and illness on the frontier was rampant, and he was not alone in the loss of several children in his life. And I think that left a mark on his soul. It had to have left a mark in his heart. That when you have children and you see them pass in front of you in some way, that had to leave a mark. Mm-hmm. His own son, John, is named after him to his first wife, is injured at the Battle of Paoli and never fully recovers. And he has to write in his last will and testament the perpetual care of this son who is He was given he's given a pension by the Pennsylvania government, and his perpetual care is taken care of by his father as well. So I think that must have left a mark on him, because that son comes back to his house and lives there with him at the house. I think one of the other challenges is how to handle slavery in his day and time. The institution of slavery is something that's hard for us to understand looking backward. But he had 6 persons that he owned who were employed in his household. And so how does he take care of them, and how does he look after them? So he's part of the first Manumission Act in the first of all of the colonies. Pennsylvania writes the first act and puts into policy and legislation and law the eventual release of all persons enslaved here in the colony of Pennsylvania. And he's part of that. He's part of that documentation. He's part of writing that paperwork and making that happen as part of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And then in his last will and testament, he makes arrangements for each one of those 6 individuals, either for their immediate release and care or for their perpetual care. And he sets aside money as a part of his estate so that each one of his servants, each one of the African Americans that he has enslaved is taken care of and released into freedom. That must have been a challenging thing to do in a world where the institution of slavery was alive and well.
I bet. What a good man.
Right.
What a good man.
Yeah.
We know he had a vision.
Mm-hmm.
What else would you say drove him?
Well, he, like many of us, he's getting up every day. He's going to work every day. But what I think sets him apart and puts him in that category, as you mentioned, of Milton Hershey, is that he was an entrepreneur. He had an entrepreneurial mindset. He looked at things the way most of us do not look. He looked at things to see what he could do with them and for them to advance the world around him. And so he saw things in his life as opportunities, as tools, as moments in time that he could leverage to move things into a new direction. And he did so in such a way that gave him an integrity and a trustworthiness. Sometimes those two don't always go together. Mm-hmm. But for him and for the likes of, you've mentioned Milton Hershey, and I do appreciate that I put him in that same category. Mm-hmm. That they did it with integrity and trustworthiness. And that, I think that's what set him apart. That entrepreneurial spirit of seeing what's possible and then inviting people to come in and share that vision with you.
There's a story about Milton Hershey when he was building the factory and building the town, that one of his foremen came to him and said, "Mr. Hershey, we found a piece of equipment that we can purchase, and it will take the place of 40 men and save you a lot of money." And he said, "Get rid of that piece of equipment and go hire 40 men."
Yeah.
So it's like these guys are cut from the same cloth, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
You're listening to InSight here at Vision Resources of Central Pennsylvania, our audio services division. I'm Father Michael, one of the volunteers here, and I'm honored to have with me as our guest today Pastor Dave Biser, the author of Visionary Road to the Capitol, the little-known story of John Harris Jr. Dave, what surprised you most about John Harris in writing this book?
Well, that's wonderful. So there were several things that surprised me. Some of them were very positive, and some of them have a negative connotation to them. The positive ones was his generosity. I did not expect to see the generosity that I experienced in reading. He gave 3,000 pounds to the American Revolutionary cause, delivered it in person to the Continental Congress. So he was very purposeful about making sure that his resources were given out and shared. He gave away land. He granted land for the Capitol. He granted land for Christ Church here in Harrisburg. He donated all of the stone for the building of Paxton Presbyterian Church, quarried it himself and delivered it himself with his Conestoga wagons that he had built. So incredibly generous individual. The story is told that when Whitefield was preaching through America, he was so mesmerizing that people would forget that they had to go out into the fields and harvest their food. And so John Harris gave storehouses of food to people who found themselves in positions of hunger because they had been off listening to this radical evangelist named Whitefield. Little stories like that were just uncommonly fun to hear that kind of generosity. On the negative side, he was a product of his day. He's a slave owner. He owns people. He puts them in their own housing situations. He's treating them. He's educating them. So there was a positive there. I saw the positive thing, but I also recognize he's part of a time period where the institution of slavery was alive and well. In that same note, he's caught up in the struggles of living on the frontier. And one of the things I came across that I found almost shattering to my way of thinking was that there was a bounty put out on native scalps by the government of Pennsylvania. There was such a problem with the native uprisings on the western frontier that they sent people out to eliminate natives at any cost. And if you brought back a scalp of a native, they would pay you. And so John Harris was the middleman in that process. Frontiersmen would bring him scalps, and he would buy them, and then he would take them down to Philadelphia and deliver them. And so that was troubling to read that. He's a product of his day, but it's still maybe more of a commentary on what kind of world he lived in. And so to reverse that, he later on in life became very involved in making sure that education was available for every single person. And so he started the Harrisburg Academy out of his own house and with his own funds, with a group of men that he pulled together. And he was committed to making sure that the world around him would look differently through the means of education.
Dave, I got to tell you, you write in your preface, I will tell the story of John Harris Jr. in a more narrative than biographical way. And you nailed it. I read a lot of biographies. I love history. This book was so fun to read and so interesting and so enjoyable. And so the question I have as we wind down this interview is, how do our listeners get this book?
Well, that's a great question, too. It's available online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can find it at the Pennsylvania State Museum, as well as Midtown Scholar in Harrisburg and the Dauphin County Historical Society. It's covered and carried by all those. You can also find it at the Dauphin County Library System. It's in all of our local libraries in Dauphin County that are currently carrying it as well.
Dave Biser is a pastor at Cross Point Church in Harrisburg, and he's the author of Visionary Road to the Capitol, the little-known story of John Harris Jr. Dave, what a pleasure it's been to have you with us. Thank you so much today.
Thank you for having me in the studio today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. This is InSight, a service of Vision Resources of Central Pennsylvania's Audio Services. Thanks for joining us.